Now, I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Kulin Nation, the 5 branches of the Kulin Nation, and we accept that they haven't ceded their sovereign rights to the land. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm doing a presentation on the Paris Commune. I'd like Paul to come up here for a minute. I've never met Paul before. He's come all the way from Bairnsdale to listen. So, Paul, you get a bag of garlic, which I grew myself.
Thanks very much, Joe.
That'll help you get home, mate. All right. Yeah, look at that, Bairnsdale. Now, I've got a number of apologies, but stuff them. Okay? Now, Paris Commune, esoteric subject. Everybody thinks it's an esoteric subject. Most people don't even know what it is, for a very good reason. Because it was the first workers' government in human history. Now, we all know about the axis of evil. And we're told it's Syria, North Korea and Iran. Well, there's another axis of evil which has blighted the human race for thousands of years, and that's religion, God, king, country. When I talk about God, I'm not talking about people's personal beliefs, but I'm talking about organised religion and the tens if not hundreds of millions of people who have died as a result of conflict between people who believe they're God's chosen people or their way is the right way. When I talk about king, I'm not necessarily talking about hereditary monarchs in the 2023. I'm talking about people who've got power, and in many cases unlimited power, whether they're self-appointed like Mr. Putin or elected like Mr. Biden. And when I talk about country, I'm talking about the concept of the sovereign nation state. In human history, we have been asked to sacrifice ourselves for those 3 principles, irrespective of the language we speak, irrespective of our cultures, irrespective of where we come from, the colour of our skin. It's all about people who are in positions of authority. The thing about the Paris Commune is, it was the first time in human history, in 1871, where we saw a popular, anti-capitalist, egalitarian, social revolution which ignored God, king and country. So let's give you a little bit of background. In 1870, actually I think it was July 1870, Emperor Louis Napoleon III, one of the biggest losers in his history, right, was concerned about the vacant Spanish throne, as the Prussians under Otto von Bismarck were going to capture the Spanish throne. So he declared war against Prussia. He'd forgotten that Otto von Bismarck had a policy of blood and iron, where he's trying to unify the different Prussian areas into one state, the German state, and that they had rapid fire artillery, they had railways to bring troops to the front line, and within 6 weeks, Emperor Louis Napoleon III, his generals, and 65,000 French troops had surrendered. The people of Paris were livid. They went to the Bourbon Palace and demanded that the empire come to an end, that the war against Prussia continued, and that they declared a republic. So a provisional republic was declared. A provisional government was declared and was called the Republic for National Defence. This was on the 4th of September 1871. Within a few weeks, what we saw is that the the so-called Republic, deserted Paris on the 19th of September 1871, that's 2 weeks after it was declared, and went off to the palace at Versailles with the French army, leaving the Paris population at the mercy of the Prussian forces, which had laid siege to Paris. And over the next 6 months, there was a tussle for power between the Republican government and the people of Paris. Now, the Republican government collapsed because of the Prussian military superiority within 6 weeks, and they entered negotiations. And the 3 negotiating points which they agreed to is: 1, compensation of 5 billion francs, which in today's money is about $500 billion. The Prussians wanted them to cede the provinces of Lorraine and Alsace, which were on the border with Prussia. That's like us ceding in Australia Tasmania and South Australia. Some people would say not much great loss, but that's another question. So, and thirdly, and this is the sting in the tail, Otto von Bismarck and the Prussian generals wanted the Republican government to put down the revolt in Paris. They wanted French to slaughter French, because Otto Bismarck didn't believe it was right that he sacrificed 1 troop to recapture Paris when the French hierarchy would do it for him. So on the 18th of September, very important day, this is the beginning of the Paris Commune, on the 18th of September 1871, 4,000 French troops from Versailles come up to Paris, which is surrounded by Prussian troops, and attempt to capture the only cannons in Paris at that particular point in time. And that's the cannons at Montmartre, which is a prominent suburb in Paris. The women who are attached to the vigilance committees, which have sprung up across Paris, draped their bodies over the cannons. The French troops refused to shoot their countrywomen, but instead shot their general and joined the Paris Rebellion. What happened then is that Otto von Bismarck gave the French Republic an order to redesign, refashion the French army to retake Paris. And 2 weeks later, what we saw is that the French army besieged Paris. So what was so radical about this? Within a week of the 18th of September 1871, the majority of people in Paris, the richer elements, had fled Paris and had gone to their country estates and joined the government in Versailles. They elected 80 representatives. Over 240,000 people voted. At the same time, what happened is that a National Guard was established in Paris, and over 400,000 men and women in 234 battalions were assigned to protect Paris with what little armaments they had, and there was a special women's battalion. Now, when the people were elected into power, there were skilled workers, unskilled workers, accountants, doctors, lawyers, small business people. The 80 people elected reflected the composition of the Parisians who actually wanted independence. And they had a radical agenda which had been formulated to a large degree from the ideas of Proudhon, who was one of the early European anarchists in the 1840s and 1850. Ideas which are based on federalism and municipality. So what is a commune? A commune is just basically a French word for a local municipality. It was the governing organ during the French Revolution. So the Paris Commune made a number of very important decisions. It abolished conscription, It required people to volunteer to be part of the national defence of the country. It put a moratorium on debt foreclosures. It closed down pawn shops. It stopped the interest being levied on debts for 3 years. And it allowed people to set up cooperatives and disuse factories and buildings which had been left empty by their owners who had fled Paris. At the same time, it extended pensions to common law wives and children who'd been excluded from that. Then it made a very important decision. It created the separation of the state and church, confiscated church property to be used by the Commune, and stopped giving financial assistance to the church, which was very powerful in France at that particular point in time. They also did something else which was very radical. Instead of appointing senior officials in the education department, in the justice department, in the armed forces, they were elected by people. So these were very radical ideas which were introduced in a very short period of time, while the city was being besieged by over 150,000 French Republican troops. And for 8 weeks, they resisted. For 8 weeks, the Versailles troops were not able to break into Paris. I mean, it got to the stage where people were eating rats to survive. Over 10,000 people died during those 8 weeks defending Paris. The city was overrun on the 21st of October 1871. So we denote the period from the 18th of September 1871 to the 21st of October 1871, a 10-week period, as the period of the Paris Commune. So all these, it's also had some other interesting concepts. It was anti-militarist, it was internationalist, and it promoted a feminist agenda. As I said before, there was a female battalion. Equal wages were introduced for large sections of the Parisian community, irrespective of people's gender. The guillotine was publicly burnt, the hated guillotine, and I could go on and on. Even our good friend here, George, who's a baker, had a hand in the Paris Commune as a baker, because the bakers were sick of getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and baking bread, and they didn't have to start work till 7 in the morning in the Paris Commune. So, you like that, George? So, I'm just saying there were all these little things happening in the midst of a siege, in the midst of bombardments, in the midst of people being killed. French against French. French against French. Let's not forget, and I want to finish this, let's not forget it was French against French. The Prussian troops were on the outskirts of the city watching the battle, because that was the price that the Versailles government was willing to pay, because this was a radical reformist agenda which shifted the tax burden, promoted international agenda. I mean, their slogan was, the Commune's flag is the World Republic flag. They're internationalists. As long as you are in the Commune at that particular point in time, it didn't matter who you were, you could be elected to a position of authority within that Commune. So national boundaries were broken down. Divisions among gender were diluted. Egalitarian concepts were promoted. Militarism, in terms of the conscription and a standing army, was abolished. A standing army was abolished, and the only country in the world today that hasn't got a standing army is Costa Rica, believe it or not. And the National Guard which was full of volunteers, was the only defence system that they actually had. So it's losers like you and me being part of that National Guard to defend the city. So what happened on the 21st of October? And this is the story that it's not told. When the Versailles troops broke through into Paris and people started to surrender in pockets, one of the worst mass slaughters in European history began. French upon French. An eyewitness account from a Englishman said, "They fought like devils, much better than the men. I had the pain of seeing 52 shot dead in front of my eyes, although they had surrendered and been disarmed." So across the city began a mass slaughter of men, women and children. And within 1 week, 30,000 Communards had been executed. 30,000 summarily shot. There were so many bodies on the streets, they constructed piles, funeral pyres of human beings, and burnt every shred of evidence. The working class suburbs where the revolt had occurred were razed in Paris, were razed to the ground. Remember that at that stage there is photographic evidence of what occurred. And if you go on the web, look up the Commune, look at the photographic evidence. And it was urban warfare at its most worst. But it was French against French. It was the French Republic. And the French Republic that everybody's so proud of in France is built on the blood and bones of 30,000 Communards. That's 20% of the people involved in the revolt were executed. Another 30% were either arrested, imprisoned or deported to Noumea, and I'll talk about that as the second part of this presentation. More people died in that week than died during the whole French Revolution. And everybody knows about the reign of terror during the French Revolution, but nobody knows about the reign of terror which occurred in Paris in 1871. So, what's the link to Australia? Are there any lessons to be learnt in 2023? Well, in 1853, the French authorities colonised New Caledonia, which consisted of Noumea and a number of islands around Noumea, and including the Île des Pins. They wanted to set up a penal colony. They wanted to follow the example of the British. And as convict transportation ceased on the east coast of Australia, they set up a penal colony in Noumea. 5,000 of what they described as the hardened Communards who hadn't been executed were in 1873-74 deported to the Île des Pins, which is an island which I've been on, which is off the coast of Noumea, and some of you may have been on that particular island. Any troublemakers among those who'd been deported were actually sent to the main penal colony in Noumea, where the most brutal punishment was meted out. The French authorities told the British government there is no way any of these destroyers of civilization, that's what they were characterised as, destroyers of civilization, destroyers of everything that civil liberty has brought to the world. Reminds us of Australia sometimes. You know, could never escape from the Île des Pins in Noumea, because Noumea is only 3,000 kilometres from Australia. In 1873, the steamship Orne, O-R-N-E, docked into Melbourne Harbour for provisions. It had 550 prisoners on board, 400 were sick, 380 had scurvy, which is unforgivable in 1873. Everybody knew then what scurvy was all about. One of the Communards escaped from the ship. here in Melbourne. His name was Michel Serine. And he changed people's attitudes about the Communards, who they were. He was feted in Melbourne. The Ballarat Courier talked about this man who was feted by his countrymen. And Marcus, any of you remember the man who wrote For the Term of His Natural Life? Marcus Clark. Term of His Natural Life? Great historical thing. He interviewed Michel and had a number of stories about the situation of the Communards published in the Melbourne Argus, and money was raised to assist the prisoners on the ship, but the ship's captain refused to accept the money or goods in exchange for the money. A year later, in July 1874, the unthinkable happened. The 6 most important Communards in Noumea escaped and made their way to Newcastle and then Sydney, where they were feted as heroes. There were political receptions, civic receptions, and they were even given a bottle of gold nuggets to assist them with their travels back to Europe. We had extraordinary, these are the 6 of the main Communards that are still alive. We had Henri Rochefort, who was a newspaper owner and journalist, who had a visceral hatred for the French government in Versailles, the French Republic. Very influential in terms of the Paris Commune. Then we had Pascal Grousset, who was the foreign minister for the Commune. That's akin to Penny Wong, right? The foreign minister to the Commune. Then we had, I think it was Henri Jourdet. I could be wrong, but Jourdet. He was the finance minister of the Commune. Then we had Achillon Belliere, who was an architect, and he was the aide-de-camp of General Rossel, who was the actual head of the National Guard in the Commune. And then we had, and this one I remember, Charles Payne, who was actually the Secretary for Foreign Affairs. And last but not least, we had one of the senior commanders of the National Guard who escaped with them. So people's attitudes in Eastern Australia and the colonies had changed because people began to see what this was about. Because you've got to remember, this period in Australian history was the germ of Australian nationalism and Australian radicalism, because the convict transportation had ceased. People were talking about organising. The 8-hour day had come into force. There were people involved in trade union struggle. Unskilled workers were organising. So this experience had a profound effect on the development of Australian radicalism, which culminated in almost a general strike in the 1890s, the Shearers' strike, where the whole east coast of Australia was paralysed. We had tens of thousands of people on the streets in Melbourne. We had machine gun nests with machine guns placed on the top of Parliament, to protect the government of the day. So these experiences of the Communards had an impact on Australia, because in 1879, 1880, there was a general amnesty. The political situation had changed in France. There was a general amnesty for all the Communard prisoners. And many of these prisoners came to live in Australia because they weren't going to go back to Paris or to France because their families had been slaughtered. The memories they had were difficult. So they came here, but they kept their radical ideas which were against the concept of God, King and country. So The 18th of March, in a few days' time, 3 days' time, marks the 152nd anniversary of the Paris Commune. It won't be celebrated, and it won't even be celebrated in Paris, except by small groups. People have forgotten that story. It's not that they've forgotten, it's almost been written out of history. I'll give you some examples. Who's been to Paris? Did you love those wide boulevards? It was wonderful, wasn't it? All those wide boulevards. Do you know why they've got wide boulevards? So next time, cannons, in those days cannons, next time they could bring in cannons into the working class suburbs and shoot the shit out of people if they rebelled. But let's not forget, in May 1968, the French students and workers used those same cobblestones to bring France to a halt. The uprising in May 1968. Extraordinary situation. Louise Michel, one of the most prominent anarchists, female anarchists in history, to which a subway station is named after in Paris, came to Sydney in 1879 when she was pardoned and gave a talk in the Sydney Domain. At the same time, she went up to the French consul and said that she would be doing talks about the Paris Commune around Australia unless he bought her a free ticket on a fast clipper back to Paris, which he did forthwith. The Phantom of the Opera. Think about the Phantom of the Opera. Couldn't think of anything more ridiculous, could you? Well, the idea of the Phantom of the Opera, when it was first written, the book was written, came from the discovery of the body, the skeleton, of a Communard, which was found under the Paris Opera House when it was redeveloped. So there are many, many, many similarities. Now, in an era in the 21st century of increasing centralisation of power in the state, and we see that everywhere, whether it's Australia, whether it's Russia, whether it's the US, whether it's China, we see more and more power being centralised in a very restrictive, oppressive state apparatus. In an era where we see the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, the lessons of the Paris Commune, the push for egalitarian change is still very relevant. Because those of you who listen to 3CR, I think about a year ago, I did a 10-part series with people in the autonomous zone of northeast Syria. And I did a 10-part series. And they have in place the same concepts as the Paris Commune. They're not a sovereign nation state. They reject that concept. They're an autonomous zone which is based on a federation of voluntary associations of local initiatives. It's a federation of local initiatives. If you look at the historical account of the Paris Commune, they were trying to create a new government, a new form of government based on the voluntary association of all local initiatives. In other words, an egalitarian concept as far as government was concerned. So what we find is as power is concentrated, as wealth is concentrated, as people become privatised, they become apolitical, they become apathetic because it feels as if there's no point fighting back because you're going to lose constantly. We see people's energies go into consumption. We see an economy based on consumption for consumption's sake. We see people reinterested in religious-based organisation. We see people consumed by issue-orientated politics as if that their issue is the only issue in the world. We get to a period that if there is a crisis, it's people like us who've got an understanding of the importance of cooperative behaviour who can influence things. Because whether you look at the Paris Commune, whether you look at North and East Syria, the autonomous zones there, they both grew out of a period of profound crisis where the structures which were in place were no longer able to provide security, protection and access to the basic necessities of life. And in those situations, you have two things happen. You either have a demagogue seize power, and that happens normally 95% of occasions, but occasionally you see a more cooperative, democratic-based movement. Because ultimately, the difference between us and the animals, the fact that we destroyed 54 human species, the Cro-Magnon race, which we are all part of, the fact is, it's not our weapons that are important, it's not our brain that's important, it's the ability to cooperate. It's the ability to cooperate, it's the ability to share. And if you look at First Nations people, not just in this country, but around the world, which are not based on the sovereign nation state concept, which are not based on some type of organised religious concept, which are not based on a hereditary leadership in many cases, but a leadership based on experience or age or whatever. It's cooperation which allows them to survive against the elements. So that's the important lesson I'd like to think about when I look at these things is it's human cooperation, because we can compete as much as we like, but when we compete there's always winners and losers. It's a little bit like buying a Tats Lotto tickets. Millions lose, so 3 or 4 win. And that's the story of life in a private investment for private profit society. So tonight, if you've got a drink, I'd like you to get up. If you haven't got a drink, go get one, and we'll raise our glasses to the Communards. While we remember them, they will live forever. If we forget them, they will die. It's our collective memory, and it's their sacrifice and their struggle and the lessons they taught us, which we celebrate tonight. They lost, but they won. They lost the battle, but they won the war. So, a drink to the Communards. Salute. Now, I've got some handwritten, I've got some typed pages to give you, so you can actually see the things I've missed out. I hate using notes. I think you lose spontaneity, and I'm all into spontaneity. But I'd like to... Yeah, we'll have questions, yes. We've had the toast. Questions? Well, all right, I'll take questions, yes.
Okay, so French against French in
1871.
So 40 odd years later, World War I breaks out.
Yep.
And you got the French against the Germans.
Again,
entrenched warfare.
yes.
4 years.
Yep.
Battle of Somme.
Yep.
How did that come out? I mean,
Well, Lewis, you stole my thunder. On the 19th of March, 19th of April, next month, 19th of April, I'll be talking about the Australian anti-conscription movement and how Australian workers and civil organisations were able to stop conscription in this country and stop 60,000 other young men being sacrificed in the European killing. But why? Because we believe the trilogy, the axis of evil, God, King, Country. World War I was fought by workers at either end of a bayonet for the glory of God, King and Country. Not for freedom, as we're told. Not for freedom. Not for egalitarian struggle. It was fought for God, King and Country. And that's what I'm saying. The Paris Commune was different. They fought for themselves, their families, their friends, their communities. They didn't fight for God, they didn't fight for King, they didn't fight for country. Now, we're all being prepared for another war. We're all being prepared, nice submarines, another war coming, sacrifice your kids, sacrifice your grandkids for God, King and Country. Same story. And as long as we believe that those three primers, God, King and Country, that's what life is about, we will continue to be sacrificed. Look at the Egyptians 4,000 years ago. God, King and Country. The Romans, God, King and Country. The Spartans, it goes on and on. And the thing is, it's a mindset. Would I sacrifice myself for a God? No. Would I sacrifice my children for a God? No. Would I sacrifice myself for my country? Maybe I'm a treasonable bastard. No. Would I sacrifice myself for a king or a prime minister or a dictator? No. But would I sacrifice myself for you? If we were together, I'm afraid yes. I would sacrifice myself for your motley crew, and I'd expect the same from you.
Where's it all gone wrong, Joe? You look at history and you see the revolutions of the 60s in Chicago, LA, San Francisco, and Paris, in Greece as well, when they stood up to the junta in '74. My uncles were there.
Yep.
My family members got hurt. People had balls back then and they stood up. And
Well,
it just seems like from the late 70s onwards, we've all gone soft.
well, I think what we've got. I've got a favourite phrase, and my favourite phrase, and you've heard it on the radio program, is apathy is the aphrodisiac of those who exercise power. And you get to a stage in a society like Australia where change seems to be impossible. Even a little struggle, which I'm currently involved in, which I'm going to try to get you involved in, the hug the bunya, right? Hug the bunya, tree. Little struggle, little localised struggle, which has profound implications for the whole of Melbourne and Victoria and Australia. Local people standing up. There are so many forces which directed against you that most people believe you can't fight City Hall, there's no point fighting back. And the difference between us and many other people is, and people who do give a shit, is we've got attitude. We don't accept the dominant, I hate to use this word, paradigm. We don't accept the fact that God, King and country is what is essential to our lives. We don't accept it. Whether we do it publicly, internally, when we go to bed at night, fuck the God, fuck the country, I don't know.
The autonomous zones in Syria, are they still operative?
What are operative in Syria?
The autonomous zones in Syria.
Yeah, they're still operative, they're still going. The earthquake is a godsend, believe it or not. They were hardly touched, it was further south they were touched. The godsend is the Turkish authorities were sending in drones every day killing people. And the fact now that means that has stopped temporarily because they've got other things they need to deal with, because the Turkish people are very, very angry regarding the death toll and the devastation which shouldn't have occurred, and the poor response to the devastation. A little bit like Australia, we respond to disasters very poorly, and that's why we continue to have disasters. So the autonomous zone is still there. It's got its problems. There's friction, there's internal, but again, it's a war zone. You've got Syria on one side, you've got Turkey on the other side, which is taking about 20 kilometres into the autonomous zone, and you've got a Kurdistan to the south. But the difference is, those people sacrificed 25,000 of their young men and women fighting IS. And they brought IS to a standstill. And the lands they now occupy were the lands which IS occupied. It wasn't the US forces or the Turkish forces or the Iraqi forces which brought IS to a standstill. It was these fighters who did not want to be dominated by them. And they paid a heavy price. From a population of 5 million, 25,000 young people dead.
Syria or Turkey?
No. Kurdistan. Yeah. Well, the autonomous zone, it's not even Kurdistan, it's an autonomous zone. Yeah. Rojava movement, yeah. Yep. Yeah. I'm waving.
If the French Republic hadn't crushed
Yeah.
the Commune,
Mm.
how did the Commune succeed? Like they had Prime Minister. Sorry? Oh, sorry. I'll project. How was the Paris Commune? How I mean, they had a foreign minister and whatnot. But where were their resources? What were they drawing on to be?
They were drawing on what they had.
Right.
And obviously in the 6 months previously, when there was the tussle between the Versailles government and the Paris Commune, they would have been stockpiling weapons, stockpiling food, because they knew what was ahead of them.
Down the track, okay. So let's say
Well, down the track, they would hope that their example would spread to the rest of France, and you'd have a federalist type of system, like you'd have a commune in Lyon, maybe a commune in the countryside, form links, and that's what you do, is you form links with the people around you to survive economically. And even if you got a Paris Commune, as long as you can trade with your neighbours, they don't actually have to be your friends. We trade with everybody in Australia, although we call them enemies and we're going to fight them to the death. You know, we trade with everybody.
As you know, currently in Paris, it's good to see the streets are on fire because they're protesting about the lifting of the age of the pension.
Yeah.
Where I just see here in Australia, we're just sheep. You know, the government says this is what you're going to do. We bow our heads.
Yeah, but the difference is they've got a tradition of resistance to the state.
Is that
Right.
from the commune?
That's from before the Commune, from the French Revolution. You've got a tradition of resistance, and where there's a tradition of resistance, people tell stories. Grandparents tell their kids, and their kids tell their grandkids, and it goes on and on. There is a tradition. 1871 is only 152 years ago. It's not that long. So there's a tradition of resistance. Also, the trade unions there are in a much more powerful position. In this country, it is now illegal to strike outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. An individual worker can be fined $10,000 a day. A union can be bankrupted. In this country, the Attorney General has the power to ban any organisation he or she sees fit because they may pose a potential threat, and that could be economic, to the national interest. Because in this country, we don't have a Bill of Rights. There is nothing in the Australian Constitution to protect you from the arbitrary exercise of state power. And irrespective of what you thought about people who didn't want to be vaccinated, the fact is that we saw for the first time in Victoria rubber bullets being used against small groups of people who were protesting. Rubber bullets. Never happened before in Victoria. Here, Melbourne, about 2 years ago. So there's no protection for the individual.
And not only that, they bring in foreign forces.
Yeah, but there's no protection. No protection. You've got no constitutional protections. The High Court found that an asylum seeker can be jailed indefinitely under the Australian Constitution because they have no rights. Because under the Australian Constitution is basically a pact between the states and the federal government, the central government. It's nothing more. Every other Western nation has a Bill of Rights, irrespective of what you think of the United States of America. They do have a Bill of Rights, which has certain basic freedoms which are enshrined in their constitution. Even England, which doesn't have a constitution, has common law and rights which come from common law. We don't have that. That's why the government here can pass any legislation at any time, as long as it's got a majority in both houses of parliament, it likes to quash anything. I mean, we talk about ourselves being a free society. As I said before, you cannot withdraw your labour in this country. It is illegal to strike. And we talk about the Chinese not being able to withdraw their labour. But I could go on and on. I'm not going to. Any other questions?
What remnants of the commune is now left in France as part of the spirit of the commune?
Well, I have no idea what remnants. I assume it's just a historical. That's all it is.
If the French knew about it,
Well, they do know about it. There will be some commemorations, but the big thing is in France these days is in the state pushing Republic Day. Like we push Australia Day or Invasion Day as our day of national, identity. They push the French Revolution, because how can you celebrate your day on a day where you massacred 30,000 of your own country, men, women and children.
Maybe they can have a sorry day.
Maybe they do, I don't know. I don't know.
How do we negate negative media? The media, you know, everything's suppressed. A lot of stuff is hidden. And, you know, the negative media.
Look, all we can do, look, this has been videotaped. Young Oscar there is videotaping this, and it'll go up on the web. We do have a little bit more freedom in terms of getting ideas across. You can't expect them to fight your battles for you. I mean, occasionally you can use them, sometimes you can't. I mean, I'll give you an example. The negative connotations about anarchism. Anarchism is a simple concept. It's a concept of having a society without rulers, not a society without rules, right? Why has it got such a terrible reputation? Well, in the 1880s and 1890s, the descendants, the orphans, remember there'd be thousands, tens of thousands of orphans in Paris. The descendants of those that were murdered took up what was described as a propaganda by the deed. Over a 5 to 6 year period, attacks were carried out on heads of state. There were 44 attacks in a 5-year period across Europe, right? Everybody remembers that. Everybody remembers the anarchists with the bomb in their hand. But nobody remembers the 30,000 that was slaughtered by the state. And that's what it's about. You go to Eureka, you walk into the little information booth at the old Ballarat Cemetery, headlines in the Melbourne newspapers the day after the 3rd of December, anarchists and ruffians involved in revolt in Ballarat. All right? So for a lot of, I can't ask my enemy to define who I am. I know who I am. I know what the word anarchism means. If they want to besmirch it, it's my problem and their problem. That's why we get involved in many local actions around the city. For example, I'll give you an example. 2 weeks ago I was called to Beaconsfield. Anybody been to Beaconsfield? Little town about, well, it's part of Melbourne. It's a Melbourne suburb, 50 kilometres from the GPO, right? A local group there has been involved in a struggle for about a year. What they're going to do is they're going to build this huge road bridge, but not actually develop the railway station. And they forget to tell us there's also already a tunnel under the railway bridge for traffic. And it's because the government made a promise to get rid of all level crossings, right? In the centre is this historic home which was built in 1880, meticulously renovated. And next to it, and you'll see it on the internet in the next few days as we get our websites up, there's this beautiful bunya pine, 25 metres high, 20 metres wide, a girth of 5 metres. And we were asked to give some advice to the local committee because they know we've got a bit of a radical pedigree. So we've given them some advice, which they've taken on most of it, and we're doing a few things with them. And this is one way people dispel the myths that radicals and anarchists or socialists are somehow different to the rest of the population. We're human beings. We strive for the same things in the end. And by working together with local groups and local communities, you dispel these myths. And that's the only way I think you can do it. You've got to do it through practical. But today, unfortunately, we all live in virtual silos. People don't come to meetings. They don't go to actions. They sit on their ass and press a button and say, like. And then they get RSI of the index finger. And somehow people think because you put a message out in the virtual world that things are going to change. Things don't change without direct action. I mean, that's the history. They don't change without direct action. I mean, Dougie's been on the planet for almost 9 decades. He will tell you that things don't change. You know, a great trade unionist. These days, they jail him for life because he'd strike every day. He's not answering. He does when you get one to one, he's a brilliant talker.
And one of the main problems is you're pushing over all the building all that shit out there.
Yeah.
The units, look at what you have. they're not going to take any interest in anything.
Well, I've given them a number of ideas which they're going to carry out and we're going to be involved with them. Like a simple idea, those of you listening to one of the programs today, we've got a new hashtag that's coming out in the next day or two. It's called Hug the Bunya Bunya. We want people to go down, catch the train to Beaconsfield station, go out of the station, hug the tree, get a picture taken, put it on your media thing and make it go wild. Make the tree alive. At the same time, the conjoined twin, which is the house next to it, also gets the same protection. Simple thing. It's funny. It's got a bit of comedy. And that's what they can't stand. We can't fight against them physically. There is no way you would win a physical confrontation. They love physical confrontations. That's what they're designed to do. But they can't stand peaceful, humour, peaceful driven, popular, and that's the key. Then we've organised a picnic for midday the 2nd of April. And guess what midday the 2nd of April is, which is a Sunday? It is Grand Prix Day. And again, you get the juxtaposition. You're not interested in the noise? Come down for the people's picnic, down at the Bunya Bunya tree, you know? So, but you've got to learn to work with communities, and you give advice. You can't impose your agenda on their agenda. It's like the West Papuan movement. And there's a number of people here in the rent collective, right? We pay the rent. They conduct their struggle in the way they see fit. We don't tell them how to conduct their struggle. And again, you influence people by your example. But there's only a few of us that makes little difference. But if more and more people get involved, it does make a significant difference. And you don't need many people to change the course of history. You need people who are willing to put themselves out, but you don't need many, especially in an era of instant communication where our virtual world does have some positive aspects to it. Could you imagine police coming and dragging people away from hugging the Bunya Bunya tree? It'd be hilarious. Not a good look. Another one. Tactics. You've got to have tactics in life. Look, I say to people, you see a brick wall, right? Do you run against the brick wall and bash your head against it until you drop dead? Or do you walk around it, dig under it, or get a ladder and climb over it? And it's the same with struggle, political struggle, social struggle. You need to be light on your feet. You need to be, as Mr. Muhammad Ali used to say, was it fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee. You need to be able to change tactics. Strategy. You need strategy. And that strategy can't be fixed. It's got to change with the thing, and you've got to work with those people. All right, look. Well, you get a lot of it online if you look. I mean, books, but computers are good as long as you put in the right words. That's the key. You will get some very negative critiques of the Paris Commune. You'll get some historical accounts, but it's there. It's there. First thing you do is look at Wikipedia. I know you can change it, but it's a good beginning. That was Paris 68. That was when the new left was born. That was a left which wasn't controlled by the old communist parties. It was a new left which was based on popularly led egalitarian concepts. There were riots through France. They brought the country to a halt, and they nearly changed things, but just didn't get over the hump. There were big national strikes, yeah. So in Australia, and the other thing we're going to ask for, and it's a little bit like asking the vampire not to drink blood, we're going to ask the CFMEU to put a green ban on this particular tree and this particular development, which I doubt they'll do because they're going fat on the profits of all this unnecessary gold-plated construction which is going on in Melbourne currently. But you never know. If you don't try, you don't know. Yeah. And we've approached the Boonwurrung land.
And you know what's funny about them, Joe? when you listen to the Concrete Gang, they always promote to appoint the building, what was it called when Norm Gilligan was around?
BLF.
BLF, yeah. So to what point are they going to do what Norm Gilligan did in relation to protecting the historical importance?
At the end of the day, it's like police, building workers, health workers, we're all part of the same community. And I remember the Labor Day. Remember we had Labor Day holiday on Monday? Most of you don't even remember what it's about. You think it's all about Moomba. It's actually about Labor Day, which is a very important holiday in Victoria. And if you look at pictures in the 1890s and early 200s, tens of thousands of trade unionists would march behind their banners. And it wasn't until Henry Bolte brought in the concept of Moomba to actually sabotage what Labor Day was all about. And there's an interesting backstory. Mr. Onus, the father of Lynn Onus, I've forgotten his first name, a prominent Aboriginal activist here in Victoria, was also a prominent trade unionist. And the new committee was looking for an appropriate name for the day. And he said to them, Moomba, which in his traditional language means up your bum. That's right, Mumba's bum, Mumba. So that's what we celebrate on. But what I'm saying is that history's forgotten. People forget because we live in a now society. It's all about consumption, what's happening now. I'll give you an example. I nearly killed a woman, a baby, a dog and a telephone yesterday because I was going to Beaconsfield, right? It's a 4-lane highway and it's got a thing in the middle, right? But it has traffic lights, right? And this traffic light was green and I was just, motoring along, happy to see going to see the bunya tree, happy I'm going along. And this woman pushing a tram with a dog attached to the pram was looking at her phone, crossing the road on a green light. And I had to brake suddenly. All this noise, she didn't look up from the phone, just kept walking. And that's what I'm saying. That's a corollary for the type of society we're in today.
You had the green light.
I did. Yeah. And you see this all the time. You see people are just so preoccupied in the moment because that's the type of society we live in. We don't think about the past. We may have dreams about the future, but we don't understand that we're here because of this and this and this and this. People whinge, as you said. They whinge when the pension age is increased. They don't understand that pensions haven't always existed. They whinge when they can't get urgent medical treatment at a public hospital. But they don't understand that that is a relatively new innovation, public hospitals. They don't understand what privatisation has done to this country in the last 40 years. Because there is no sense, there is no historical record. We are a country without a past. And it comes from, obviously, the original colonisation process, where the original inhabitants were driven out, murdered, we took their lands, and we didn't want to hear about it. Simple.
I guess it's an observation, but there was a couple of people mentioned like apathy and how do you get people motivated when they're worried about some Telstra shares and blah blah blah. But I found that there's a lot of stuff out there like that bunya like out where I live, there's a group called Knox Environment Group, and I'd never heard in my life, but I heard about them just by accident 4 years ago. They had a campaign up there, and so there's stuff out there. You just gotta
find it.
And like what you said, they're just little groups, little action. Might sound insignificant, but sometimes just latching onto other things.
Yeah.
And then you'll find like-minded people. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel.
No, you never have to reinvent the wheel. Never start from scratch, I agree.
Yeah.
It's a waste of time.
There's stuff out there.
Yeah.
If you listen to 3CR 24/7, there's probably like 30 groups that you probably never heard of that
Yeah.
got little shows on there.
Yeah.
You probably never
Yeah.
existed.
Yeah.
And other
Yeah. Look, I don't want to bore you forever. We have entertainment. We have entertainment. No, sorry. No male strippers tonight for you. That's it. Yes, I'm going to put entertainment on. We have the one and only Tony Millman. Now, Tony is not just an entertainer, he's an activist. I had him groomed. I was grooming him to be a star at 3CR, but he threw it all in because he couldn't stand being told what to do. Not by me, but by the bureaucracy. He threw it, he threw it all away to start him. That's why I'm still there. I'm looking for somebody else to groom. Would you like to be groomed?
Me?
Yeah. Good. We'll bring you into 3CR.
That's an excellent arrangement.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
Yeah. Now we've got young Tony here.
Thank you, Joe.
Come and say something about yourself before you launch in. And
Thanks for your erudition and your charisma, your hard work tonight.
thank you.